Welcome back, everybody. We are on season 3, episode 2 of Ichabod's House podcast. Right?
Yeah. Crazy.
Yeah, exciting stuff. So this is the Mothman part 2. And I'm your host, Andy, here with my wonderful sister, Jen.
Good morning, afternoon, evening,
And good night.
happy Friday, happy Monday, whatever.
Whatever day it is. Yeah, I think that sounds great. Sup? We do have a Google and Beyond from last week's Mothman Part 1 episode. Incidentally, it has nothing to do with the Mothman.
It doesn't. It was who's playing Perry Mason in the current HBO series, and it's Matthew Rhys. Juliet Raylands is Della Street, and Chris Chalk is Paul Drake. So there you go.
I know the Matthew dude played on The Americans, but he played on some. Oh, was it Brothers and Sisters? I think it was Brothers and Sisters.
See, now you're just creating more Google and Beyond shit for us to do.
I gotta figure out what he played in before that because I really liked him as that character and I couldn't watch him in The Americans. All right. Okay, sorry. Went off on my little Matthew. I thought it was Reese, but whatever.
Who knows?
Reese. Okay. Ichabod's nose pick. What you got a long, stringy, gooey one today?
I do. It's actually a Spanish one on Netflix called Phenomenon, and it's about 3 middle-aged women ghost hunters from the 1990s and a little supernatural battling they do based on true events. They were actual real-life women, and so
Really?
It's Spanish, it's subtitled, it's awesome. Really enjoyed it. I also went to see the movie Renfield in the theater last week.
What's that about?
It's Nicolas Cage plays Dracula, and his Renfield is attending these support groups for people who are in toxic relationships with narcissists. It is very well done. It is over the top comedic horror, gore, and absurd. Laugh out loud funny, very entertaining. 2 thumbs way up on that.
I love it.
I wish awesome. I had more thumbs to give it thumbs up.
I love it. That is so awesome.
Yes.
Hopefully, maybe I can get Chris to go with me to see that. Yeah.
So good.
That's
so. What do you got?
Well, I have 2 as well. One is I started watching Lucifer. Now I think you watched that a long time ago. And my husband has watched it as well. And he's told me, for a couple of years now, how good it is. And so I started watching that and it is deliciously wonderful. Uh-huh. And I love him. Who knew I'd love Satan?
I know.
He's lovely. Mm-hmm. And just the character development in that. And that's why you love it, right? I think that's why you love it because he's not an asshole all the time. And I love that he sees a therapist. I think that's hysterical. Mm-hmm. The whole thing about it is it's very, very good. So if you need a show to watch on Netflix, I highly recommend Lucifer. But I don't know, I don't remember if we talked about this podcast last season or not, but there's a podcast that I've been listening to and it's called Morbid. And it's with 2 sisters as well. Well, I think they're actually an aunt and niece, but they were raised as sisters. So they call each other as sisters. Mm-hmm. And they do stories like we do. They do paranormal stuff and true crime. They do it a little differently though. They one of them writes it and then tells the other one about it. Mm-hmm. But anyway, that one's funny and just fun. It reminds me a lot of us. Anyway, so I like that one too.
Nice.
That one's good.
All right. Well, anything else?
No, I'm ready to get back into it.
Okay. Well, when we last gathered here in the parlor of Ichabod's house, we gave you lots of background, ad nauseum even, on winged humanoids appearing at random through the years. These sightings were interesting, but none of them captured the attention that the Mothman of Point Pleasant did.
As you'll recall, 2 couples, Roger and Linda Scarberry, together with Steve and Mary Millette, encountered the Mothman at the TNT area several miles outside of I know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. Point Pleasant's city limits.
They reported the incident to the cops. The sheriff held a press conference, and the newspapers printed the story. Now we ask you, what happens when a monster shows up in the South?
I'll tell you, it doesn't matter if the monster is a fecophiliac
Fecophiliac,
with a boob fetish like the Falk monster,
or a levitating glowing creature like the Kelly Green Goblin.
or a man-shaped winged creature like the Mothman.
If you are a cryptid and you show up in the South, people are going to grab their guns and start shooting at you.
But will they hit you?
They probably really won't. We've learned this.
I don't think that they will.
Nobody in the South can hit anything.
Yeah. Well, listen, they can. They just don't hit cryptids.
Yeah.
So when news of a winged menace with red eyes chasing cars down the highway broke, folks in Point Pleasant grabbed their guns and raced to the TNT area, because that's what you want around explosives, is other explosives.
Right.
Yeah. Going at, top-notch speed. They circled in their cars, keeping their eyes peeled for red eyes and dark wings. Sadly, few bothered to look up where a bright red light glowed in the night sky just above the crowd.
But Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Walmsley and Mr. and Mrs. Marcel Bennett and their baby girl, let me do that one over. But Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Walmsley and Mr. and Mrs. Marcel Bennett and their baby girl Tina were paying attention, and they didn't know what the hell that thing was.
Mrs. Bennett said this: "It wasn't an airplane. We couldn't figure out what it was, and she has a British accent. I don't know why."
She's very refined for living in Point Pleasant.
She's very highbrow.
She is very highbrow. The Bennetts and the Walmsleys were on their way to visit the Thomases who live nearby. Ralph Thomas was the superintendent of Trojan U.S. operations near the TNT area. And I don't know what Trojan U.S. operations was. Allow me to just put that on the Google and Beyond list.
Okay. Well, that I'm excited to find out what that is. That's what she said. Okay. Keel describes Virginia Thomas as he is such a dick. Okay. Keel describes Virginia Thomas as a slender woman, blessed or cursed with second sight.
Sadly, Mrs. Thomas's second sight failed to alert her that company was coming, and she and her husband weren't at home. They were at church.
Damn that second sight.
So, yeah.
Sometimes you get interference. If it's raining, man, it's
fucked.
just not going to work right.
So, yeah, the two couples go up and knock on the door, and they discover they're just not home.
Okay. The two couples left the porch and headed back to their car. But as they got close, dun dun dun, a dark figure rose from the ground. Mrs. Bennett said this. See, now I want to do a Southern accent. Who knows what's going to come out of me? It seemed as if it had been lying down as it rose up slowly from the ground, a big gray thing, bigger than a man with terrible glowing red eyes.
I picture Snoopy in the pumpkin patch on How It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, where he just
looks around like a periscope.
Yes. So Mrs. Bennett was surprised. She was so surprised that she dropped her baby. And even with that baby screaming and crying in the dirt, "Oh, my baby!" I have been surprised by a few things in my life, but I've never dropped my child, ever. So even with baby Tina screaming and crying in the dirt, Mrs. Bennett couldn't pick her up. She was too shocked. As she watched, this thing stood up to its full height and unfurled its huge wings.
It reminds me of So many things in the Falk Monster story. So many things. Didn't somebody push down a woman? Like he got so scared when
He
they
shoved her down.
Shoved her down.
It's every man for himself.
Oh my God, that's hilarious.
I know. Honestly.
Okay, well, the couples finally picked up the crying baby and hurriedly barricaded themselves inside the Thomases' house where they called the police. These events were printed in the paper the following evening.
Well, as if that wasn't exciting enough, by that December, Gwendolyn Martino was at her apartment in Cherry Hill. You might remember this beautiful divorcee from last week. On this particular evening in early December 1966, she was packing for a trip to Europe when her phone rang.
The voice on the other end asked for Gwen Stevens. After some back and forth and a couple more similar calls, Gwen. Because that was back in the day when you could talk and, share stories with somebody who, when you got the wrong number.
Mhm.
And they weren't a creepy telemarketer. She mentioned the issue to Keel, who determined that the voice may have been looking for Jen Stevens, not Gwen Stevens. Oh,
This is Gwen Martino. Oh, you mean Jen Stevens.
that old chestnut gets me every time.
It happens all the fucking time. I can't tell you how many people call up for Gwen Stevens and they really mean Jen Stevens. Funny. Whatever.
Well, Jen Stevens was a UFO researcher and she was having her own issues with weird calls at that time. In 1968, she said this.
One night, when my husband Peter and I returned home, we found Jenny, our 15-year-old daughter, in a highly nervous state. She had a pimple on her nose and she was fucking pissed about it. She also said the phone had been ringing all evening. She'd answer it and hear nothing but heavy breathing. When her boyfriend called, they were interrupted several times by high-pitched beeping noises and were also cut off twice. The next day, the calls continued. Sometimes there'd be mechanical sounds, and others, the high-pitched whining beeping sound that sent sharp pains through the mastoid bones. Right, these are those bones right back here behind your ears. Also made people shit the pants involuntarily at times, from time to time. So several days after our telephone problems began, my husband, who is a building contractor, was in a large downtown Schenectady store inspecting some work and dropped into the snack bar for a cup of coffee because who the fuck doesn't do that? Sometimes you just need a fucking cup of coffee. Anyway, a few minutes later, a tall and saturnine looking man sat down next to him and started this conversation. He began with, "There have been people watching the sky every night down by the river in Scotia." And my husband's like, "What the fuck?" So anyway, the man proceeds to talk about UFOs. And he finally said this: people who look for UFOs should be very, very careful.
Especially down by the river at night in fucking Scotia.
For reals.
For reals.
For reals.
Holy sakes. I do have a question. What is Saturnine?
Grouchy.
Oh, okay. Saturnine looking man. All right. Saturnine face. It doesn't have the catch to it like resting bitch face, does it?
I have
You have a
resting saturnine face.
Resting saturnine face. I know somebody else who has resting saturnine face. I'm looking at him right now. Okay. Keel asked for a sketch of the man, so Peter made two. He kept one and gave the other to Keel. Not long after this, someone broke into the Stevens' house. Nothing was stolen except the sketch of the strange man. Interestinger and interestinger. 2 months later, Peter, only in his 30s, was dead. Dead, I tell you.
So this was the sketch of the man.
Are you going to draw a stick man? We're waiting. I love his fedora. You put a fedora on there. That's very nice. And the eyebrows slanted just right.
So,
What are you looking for? So, yes.
he spent hours making those 2 sketches.
Well, the fedora stumped him.
And then he died. For years after this, John Keel would show his copy of the sketch to people who encountered suspected men in black. Their response was always the same. The sketch looked just like the stranger they had encountered. So if you've seen this man
who flips you off on one hand, he's always flipping that finger.
Yes.
It's always out there.
It is. You are not alone.
Oh my goodness sakes. Okay, now, as we've said, it was December and the sightings of the Mothman and UFOs were not slowing down. So it was time for John Keel to leave New York and head to West Virginia to see what was up with the shapely women and the Mothman and the UFO sightings.
And the baby droppers.
And the baby droppers.
He arrived on December 7th and stopped off at the courthouse to have a word with Deputy Halstead to get the lowdown on what was going on around Point Pleasant. So remember, Keel hadn't been here yet. All this stuff is starting to happen in Point Pleasant, and he's up in New York, which is where he lived. And so he comes down, he goes to the courthouse, gets in touch with Halstead, and Halstead said this.
The people who have seen this bird, we all were, okay, I'm going to start that one over. The people who have seen this bird were all mighty scared. They saw something. I don't know what. Some say it's just a crane. Because cranes are often mistaken for large flying men.
And yeah, you know, cranes also like to bat around your porch light at night too, running right on into it.
Like, aren't cranes like really tall?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they have really long legs, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Keel was eager to talk to Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Millette to get their take on the events out at the TNT area. As luck would have it, the Scarberrys were living in the basement of Mr. and Mrs. McDaniel, who were Linda's parents.
Of course they were. Keel wrote this. I drove out to do the thing I hated most. Knock on the door of a total stranger, introduce myself as a hotshot writer from New York, and invade the privacy of people already weary from the publicity, reporters, and self-styled investigators.
Well, thankfully, the folks living in the McDaniels' basement weren't too intimidated by Keel's hotshot status to accompany him back to the TNT area. Others went along for the ride as well, including Connie Carpenter and her fiancé, Keith, Steve and Mary Millette, and Mary Heyer, local reporter.
They parked outside the old generator plant and climbed from the car. Mary Heyer, Connie and Keith, and hotshot writer John Keel headed inside. The Scarboroughs, isn't it Scarberry?
Scarberries.
I think it's Scarberries. Yeah, the Scarberries and Millettes had decided they had had enough excitement with regard to the Mothman, so they waited outside. Okay, listen. If there's a huge flying creature that people have only seen outside, I'm not going to be waiting outside. I'm going to be going inside.
For real.
For reals.
The searchers looked around for a while and at length were satisfied that the building was empty. But as they headed for the exit, Connie screamed. She said this. Those eyes! It's here!
Then, with that being a girl and all.
What with being?
With what? What with being? With that, with what? What with? Patata, Jen. All right. Then, what with being a girl and all, she became hysterical. The menfolk worked to get her outside and slapped her. Not once, not twice, but 10 times. No, I'm kidding. And once she was out of the building, Keel ran back in, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a giant fly swatter to see if he could catch a glimpse of the winged menace. So it was inside the building.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I hope we'll have a legit bullshit coming up.
Sadly, the search was fruitless. By the time he returned to the group, he discovered that Deputy Alva Sullivan had joined them, but no one even acknowledged Keel. And he's a fucking hotshot writer. And he shows up back out there and he's like, I didn't swat nothing in there, didn't see anything. And they're all like looking off. They're looking off the property, out in the distance beyond the fence, toward a dark field.
Not even paying attention to the hotshot writer with a very astute description all the time of female body.
Nope.
Not even caring about, oh my goodness sakes. Wow. That is crazy. Well, while Keel had been inside, they had all seen a tall figure running from the back of the plant. They also heard a loud noise from inside, as if a large piece of metal had been dropped from a significant height.
It was probably the Mothman bumping into the roof, trying to get out, bumping his head up there, knocking shit down.
Probably.
So Connie was still hysterical and wanted to go home. The group was trying to figure out whether or not to slap her again and tell her to calm down or just go when suddenly Mary Millette screamed, "Oh, my ear is bleeding."
And as the group looked, they discovered that a small rivulet of blood trickled from her ear canal indeed.
And now there were two hysterical women at the TNT.
But were they shapely, Jen?
Yes, they were shapely.
Oh, thank God. I'm so glad that they were shapely. Okay, Keel decided that under the circumstances, he'd be better off lone wolfing another search of the plant. Of course he would, because all hotshot writers do lone wolf. They work much better under those circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
After all, he had no way of knowing if the women were. He had no way of knowing if the women were menstruating, short of asking them. And no one wants a hotshot writer from New York to ask if they're menstruating. So he drove everyone home and returned to the plant alone to see if the Mothman was around. And to quote our favorite movie, are you, Alice
menstruating right
now?
Well, when he got back to the TNT area, he didn't see a thing, but he did experience a couple of episodes of what he called unexplained terror. He got to a place on the road outside the plant itself, and he felt himself, quote, engulfed in fear. He put the pedal to the metal, and after a few dozen feet, the fear subsided.
But the same thing happened again after he circled and returned to the same stretch of road. Get out.
Mm-hmm.
He repeated the exercise a few more times. He repeated the exercise a few more times and finally decided to park and get out of his car. He said this.
The air was perfectly still. There wasn't any audible sound, not even bird call. I was reminded of the hour of quiet that settles inexplicably over the jungle in early morning, when suddenly, usually around 2 a.m., all of the animals, birds, even insects, become totally silent for about 2 hours. If you're not used to the jungle and its ways, this sudden silence can wake you from a deep sleep.
He's a man of many talents. I'm just going to say a man of many, many talents.
For real.
So we know a couple of things now. One, it was quiet that night. And it was real quiet. And two, John Keel could totally handle it because he was well versed in the ways of the jungle and he was a hotshot rider.
He was, for real. So John walked along the road toward the scary spot he had driven through on his last few laps. It wasn't long before he found himself in the center of the fear zone once again, consumed by terror. He forced himself to continue forward and soon emerged on the other side of the heavy spot. After a few more paces back and forth, in and out of the zone, he came to the conclusion that this was what was called an ultrasonic zone of fear.
Okay, wait a minute. If it's sonic, sonic means sound.
Ultrasound, yeah.
And if there was an absence of sound, can we call it ultrasonic?
You can, because ultrasound doesn't produce sound that's audible to the human ear. So like when you
Okay,
had your pregnancy ultrasounds, you couldn't hear that.
I don't like it when you're more sciencey than me when I'm trying to be sciencey. When I'm not trying to be sciencey, I'm all for it because you are, in fact, sciencey. But when I'm trying to give a scientific something,
Mhm.
sentence or
Uh-huh.
something, I need you just to get on my bandwagon.
Got
Okay?
you.
Would you
Okay.
do that for me?
Yes.
Oh my God. Sometimes am I right, people? Am I right? Old sisters. Hand to God. No, I'm kidding. All right. Ultrasonic, ultrasound, zone of fear cannot be heard, but he was feeling it, apparently, right? Was
Yes.
that meant he was feeling it? Okay. That's right. Zones like this tend to occur when UFOs are present. An ultrasonic wave could also explain Mary Millette's bleeding ear, but does it explain the woman who dropped her baby?
That was just terror and
Bad mothering. Okay.
oh my god.
Drop my baby. At least she
Tina
didn't
is
slap the baby.
Tina's probably alive and into her 50s now, and because she wouldn't be much older than us.
Right.
And she's probably still in therapy for that. I remember that night my mom threw me at the Mothman to save herself. Ah.
Oh my God.
Anyway, okay, so let's legit or bullshit here. What do we think about the Mothman running away from the plant? So when they saw him out that field
Right.
when John Keel came back, why wouldn't he have just flown? And also, why don't these people just build a giant porch light to attract it and let nature take its course? I mean, eventually it's going to run into it enough that it
Yeah.
fries its own face, right?
Right.
So why is the Mothman in Point Pleasant? And what's with all the UFO activity going on?
Yeah, so first of all, I have to think that the first sightings were totally legit. I have to
Okay.
think that this sighting in the plant was completely a bullshit thing. That somebody dressed up and was trying to scare him. That's what I think.
Or could have just been somebody because she just saw eyes, right? So she could
Right.
have seen anything, reflection from a
Sure.
flashlight, whatever. It I'm kind of wondering if there weren't some kids around there just kind of exploring and that's what they saw run away.
For
And
sure.
maybe somebody hiding still in the plant, dropping a piece of metal or whatever.
For sure.
And then running away. I don't think that the Mothman was actually back out there again. So
Well, and again, I don't think that he would have been inside.
this is true. And unless he was, like laying eggs or something, unless they were making little baby Mothmen. Who knows?
Maybe he was changing his leisure suit out.
Maybe he was changing his leisure suit. There's also a lot of weird UFO alien activity. People are seeing these
Mhm.
aliens having these telepathic conversations. There's a lot of shit going on, which we'll get more into.
Do you think that's related? Do you think they go hand in hand?
I do. So here's another thing that I've kind of come to learn over time with doing this podcast is that um, UFOs and like Bigfoot sightings or cryptid sightings tend to occur hand in hand. So there's some speculation by UFO enthusiasts or experts that could these be could there be portals or whatever that
Mhm.
open up and allow the cryptids and the UFOs to come through? Is something, are they related? I mean, obviously we don't all know, but
Right.
anyway,
No, yeah, yeah, I wonder that as well.
yeah, right?
Yeah, well, and I wonder, are they related because they're attracting each other, or are they related because so are they related because the UFOs are coming and they know that the Mothman is here, so they want to study it like they want to study us, or are they related because they're in cahoots and they use those portals? Because the UFOs could just be studying them like they study us too.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course.
So, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to talk about. But I don't think that the thing with the TNT plant, I think that is bullshit. I don't think the people were lying. I think they think that they really saw it, but sitting here 60 years later, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something like that. I think that we can say from a safe distance, and now hindsight's 2020, that I think that they were not seeing a Mothman.
What do you think about Mary Millette's bleeding ear and the ultrasonic zone of fear?
Well, here's the thing too, right? Like we have I think that I'm gonna get a little, I don't know, spiritual here for a second or something. I don't know what you want to call it, existential. I think that we are all connected. I really, really do believe that. Um, and I think that, and if you, and they've actually proven that, right? Like if you have a group, there's a mob mentality, right? So you have a
Collective
group,
consciousness.
yeah. Oh, yes, collective consciousness. That would be a word for it. Okay. I'm just saying we're all networked, okay?
I agree with you.
So, so if everybody's but he was doing that by himself though, the ultrasonic zone of fear, wasn't he?
Yeah, but before that, everybody was really scared
And it's
and her
together.
ear started bleeding. Yeah.
Right. So the whole ear bleeding thing, I don't know about that at all. I don't know why. I wouldn't think that something would. I mean, I think if you're that scared that you'd be more apt to have a heart attack or your hair
S-
turn white than have your ear bleed. So I don't know about that business.
So I know that there were CIA people in, I think it was Cuba, people who were down there, or American diplomats who were down there, and they all reported these awful symptoms of headache, nausea, dizziness, because they kept hearing this low vibration.
Yes.
And there was concern that someone was using an ultrasonic or a sound
Right.
weapon on them.
Right.
And so I think the speculation here is that could there be something cloaked above them that was emitting an ultrasonic wave, whether intentionally or unintentionally? Maybe it was just their exhaust system or whatever,
Right.
that caused that. And it happened to create a wave that ruptured her eardrum. I mean, that's possible. She also could have slapped a mosquito and smeared blood down her, you know.
Right.
So, I mean, there's any number of things. She obviously afterwards became uh, hysterical. The other thing is,
Maybe
if you
somebody
go
slapped her really hard.
if you go someplace expecting to, one of the things that when you go into a haunted house and you expect
Yeah.
it to be haunted, you're much more likely to have an experience, right?
Right.
If you go to the TNT plant and you think that there's a winged cryptid flying around there, you're much more likely to see it because you're already expecting that, right?
Right. Right.
So I would say that there's a possibility that people here were just kind of um, already primed to witness something.
Yeah.
The witnesses were primed already. John Keel, to his credit, went back by himself, and he's got lots of books out, and he was a person who traveled the world uh, as a hotshot writer and
For sure.
was able to comment on the figures and intellect of all the women he met, I'm sure. And he did research stuff, right? So I don't think he's somebody who's going to be. He was an objective observer, perhaps not with regard to himself as a hotshot writer or with the voluptuousness of women, although I'm sure he thought he was being objective. Oh, he was objectifying them.
He
Yes,
was. He
yes,
was. That's exactly what he was doing.
he was 100% objective in all things. Yes, the objective John Keel, ladies and gentlemen. So anyway, he was somebody who wasn't emotionally invested in this. He truly
Right.
was trying to understand what was happening. So I have to credit him with that.
Right.
Anyway,
I get that.
interesting stuff.
It is interesting. What do you? But do you? But do you think that too? I guess we didn't really talk about that. That do you think that the Mothman was really in the TNT? Um, place?
I think the first time he was there, um, the first night when he chased the car, obviously that happened. I think after people grabbed their guns and went circling around that area, uh, I don't think that uh, I think that's all bullshit. And when the lady dropped her baby, and that thing rose out of the bushes and she saw its wings unfurl, I don't think that that was the Mothman either. I think somebody
Right.
was probably, because there were all kinds of people out there and this house
Right.
was close there, right?
Right.
So I'm sure that somebody just kind of stood up and she was already primed. She was already, sure she
Yeah.
was going to see something or scared of seeing something. They'd seen something in the sky. Now something stands up out of the bushes. Anyway,
Yeah. No,
so I say bullshit.
I get that. I agree with that 100%. Okay. Oh,
Okay.
now do we know why the Mothman's in Point Pleasant? Why is he in Point Pleasant? Do you have a
Um,
thought?
well, I know why he's in Point Pleasant. I mean, I know the story of it. I know
Yeah,
what
I do too.
happened.
Yeah.
So over time, they think that he was there because it all ends in this
Tragedy.
giant bridge collapsing and a lot of people dying in the river. And
Mhm.
so, and after that happened, there was no more Mothman sighting.
Right.
So certainly that's a possibility. Um, so I think that that's perhaps why the Mothman was there. I don't know what's going on with all the UFOs and the men in black. I still really suspect a lot of that was government
Yeah.
incited. I think the government was messing with people. I do. I think that they were probably experimenting on areas and
Yeah.
people and ruining lives. That's my personal belief.
Yeah, once I found out in that psychology course that I took that the government was chemically sterilizing prisoners and people with mental illness and black women, young, very young black women,
Mhm.
I don't really put much stake in our government anymore, and I really believe that they are capable of anything.
I do think that there were UFOs that were actually UFOs, not
Mhm.
government related. But I sort of suspect that the men in black that were being seen at the time or the people that were the creatures that were having telekinetic conversations with Woodrow Derenberger and taking him to Lanny Lewis, I think he was experimented on. I don't think that was a real alien abduction interaction. I think he was experimented upon, and same with the other gentleman from
Yeah.
uh, near Point Pleasant. And I shouldn't say perhaps the men in black are actually the real aliens who are around trying to figure out what was going on, because we'll get into there's a lot of men in black in and around Point Pleasant at this time too. Um, but I think that there are two things going on here. I think that uh, the Mothman, whatever it was, that's one thing.
Right.
But then the other two things, I think that you're seeing the men in black and you're seeing the UFOs. The UFOs, I think, could be some actual UFOs, but also there's a government component to that.
Okay.
The same with the people you're seeing around. Men in black versus aliens coming off spaceships. Who's government and who's not? I think you've got a mismatch. And the other thing I suspect is that the government recognized all this shit was going on, and they're sending people and agents in to confuse the shit out of it all, muddy the waters. That's my belief. I'll probably get executed. So if I end up dead, everybody remember I said this. Although it's 60 years later, they probably don't care anymore.
No, they don't care. Because they did come out and say, what was it, a few years ago, that yes, UFOs are real and
Mhm.
aliens are real. Well, thank you. People have been saying that for
Yeah,
decades,
after
almost a
you
century.
discredited them all, threatened them all, whatever. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, yeah. Okay. Interesting. All right. Well, time passed and January 1967 rolled around. One night that month, Mary Heyer was working late in the newspaper office when a little man walked in. Mary estimated his height to be about 4 feet 6 inches, and although it was freezing cold outside, He wore no coat. He had dark hair styled in a bowl cut, wore thick glasses and shoes with thick rubber soles. Well, we call those lifts. He approached the desk and asked for directions to Welch, West Virginia. So he came into a newspaper office to ask directions.
Yes.
Okay. All
And he
right.
was really short and he had a black hair and a bowl cut and wore these really big glasses, no coat,
All
thick,
right.
squeaky rubber shoes. He spoke in a high pitched, halting voice, which she found a bit frightening. She found it frightening enough that she fetched a coworker from the back to come hang out with her. The pair attempted to answer the little man's questions, and he became obsessed with a ballpoint pen, maniacally clicking it over and over and over. It was like he'd never seen one before.
Or perhaps he was just so happy that he found one that worked.
That could be.
And the click was music to his fucking ears.
Oh my
I'm just
God.
saying.
Right?
Okay, so yeah, finally annoyed with all the clicking, for sure, Mary told him he could just keep the pen. His eyes widened. He began to laugh maniacally, and then he ran out into the night with his pen.
Click, 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 click. God. All right. A couple of days later, on January 9th, the Christensen family was returning from a vacation in Florida when a stranger knocked at their door. He was a huge man, about 6'6", and he weighed in at about 300 pounds. He wore a big fur hat and a long black coat. When they asked what he wanted, he said this.
I am from the Missing Heirs Bureau. This will only take 40 minutes.
The family was perplexed. As they looked on, they realized his long coat was made of very thin material, too thin to be any protection against the cold. And when he removed his hat, they realized his head had been shaved and the hair looked like it was just starting to grow back in. There was also a perfectly round spot on the back of his head where the cables get plugged in. His eyes were huge and wide set, and one eye had a cast to it.
I'm telling you what, there are some very interesting people in this one.
Sweet Jesus.
Okay, so the Christensen said he had made a mistake, but the big weird dude insisted he needed to ask some questions. He took off his coat and they noticed he was wearing a funny looking badge. It had a big K on it and a small X, but beyond that, they didn't see much of it. Was the X like up on the top of the K, like it was an exponent, like K to the X power?
We
I
don't
don't know.
know.
Just a little math for you. But beyond that, they didn't see much of it. It was, Connie Stevenson said, as if he didn't want them to see it.
Okay, so get this. A long green wire was attached to his leg. They noticed it when he moved and his trouser leg rose above his sock. The wire came up out of his sock and disappeared up inside his trouser leg into his skin.
Oh, into his skin.
Mhm.
Okay, I was going to say catheter, but okay. But yeah, why would it go into his sock then? That wouldn't really make any sense. All right, interesting. The family offered him something to eat, but he said he was on a diet. He would, however, like a glass of water in about 10 minutes. If you could set that timer,
Mhm.
get on the ball with that, 10 minutes.
Mhm.
He asked a series of personal questions regarding Ed's medical history because your medical history is directly linked to if you're a missing heir or not. Directly. The man asked about scars and what schools Ed had attended, what cars he had owned in his lifetime, and if the family would be willing to fly anywhere in the U.S. to be present for the reading of a will.
As he spoke, his face got redder and redder, and he finally turned to Connie and asked for that glass of water. When he received the water, he pulled a yellow capsule from his pocket and swallowed it. His face then returned to normal.
So it wasn't a little red or blue pill, it was yellow.
Huh. He already took the red pill, I'm pretty sure.
Probably. Well, yeah, he had to get unplugged.
Yep.
Okay, well, let's legit or bullshit this here. What do we think of the giant wearing the Russian hat with the circle shaved in the back of his head? And why the yellow pill? Why not the blue or red? Oh, good Lord. We are just so linked in the head. I tell you what. Are we in the Matrix? I think he just got out of the Matrix. Or was he in the Matrix now?
So there's questions in ufology, I guess,
Okay.
on if these beings, when they come to our planet, have to regularly take things. They can only hold this shape, this form, survive for so long. So
Breathe our air.
they have to consume something to make it better. So they'll start to look really weird, act really weird. It might be that their body starts to melt a little, or their lips start to get really red, or they stop being able to speak, and then they're suddenly in a hurry to leave. So it seems like the timer is set once they
Right.
come in, and then they have to leave. So I'm going to have to say that this occurrence is legit, that it happened. Whether or not this guy is just some weird, mentally challenged individual selling magazines or doing work for a private investigator firm, I can't say. Versus maybe an alien or an MIB, I don't know, but it's very odd for sure.
Very odd.
Hmm.
Yeah. I don't know. I like thinking about it. I don't know. I am reserving my opinion on this one because I don't know what yet. I don't know enough yet to have an opinion on this one.
Okay, then we will move on. In early March 1967, Point Pleasant police officer Harold Harmon was patrolling the creepy old TNT area when he encountered a UFO. He said this: "It was definitely some kind of machine. I could even see." Okay, he said this: "Well, it was definitely some kind of machine. I could even see what appeared to be windows in it. It rocked unevenly like a boat hitting waves, and then it floated silently away over the trees."
UFO sightings were being reported all over the place. In Point Pleasant, Mary Heyer couldn't print all of the reports she received from in and around the area.
And if that wasn't enough of a headache, other weird reports kept coming in about three really tall men with heavy suntans. Police heard reports on this trio on a regular basis. These guys knocked on doors late at night trying to sell magazines. They didn't have a car, and no one could figure out where they were staying while in town.
And remember Mrs. McDaniel, Linda Scarberry's mom? Well, she worked at the unemployment office in downtown Point Pleasant and reported that the second week in March, a dark skinned man, very tall, with funny looking eyes, strolled into the joint.
He was looking to buy trip insurance, and he spoke in a weird sing song way that all MIB seemed to use.
Very interesting.
Mhm.
Keel felt that all the MIB and UFO sightings taking place in Point Pleasant were concerning. What the hell was going on? What were they looking for? Although Keel had recently returned to New York to resume work on other projects, he decided that, in light of all that was happening in West Virginia, he'd table everything and head back down.
This time he took two other researchers with him. Daniel Drayson was a movie producer who wanted to film a documentary on UFOs for public television. He, along with researcher Dan Estrella, accompanied Keel back to Point Pleasant.
The three traveled up and down the Ohio Valley and continued to gather tales of UFO and MIB sightings. One of the more interesting reports came from the Lilly family out on Conley Road, which ran along the southern edge of the TNT area. Patriarch James Lilly said this. Oh my gosh. James and Lily. It's Harry Potter's parents' names. Okay, go ahead.
Mhm.
He said this.
It didn't take us long to learn that when our TV started acting up, it was a sure sign that one of those lights was passing over. I didn't think much of all the flying saucer talk until I started seeing them myself. You've got to believe your own eyes.
And Mrs. Lilly said this. We've seen all kinds of things blue lights, green ones, red ones, things that change color. Some of them have been so low that we thought we could see diamond shaped windows in them, and none of them make any noise at all.
Things got even weirder. Cars driving past the property would stall, and inside the house, cabinet doors opened and slammed in the night. One morning, the family woke to find their living room door standing open, the door they were sure they had locked the night before. They also heard the sound of pots and pans being dropped in the kitchen and babies crying.
Well, because they keep dropping the damn babies too.
And babies crying, and that is a very common thing with UFO activity as well. But
Isn't it just common because it's common?
I don't. Well, I mean, the sound of babies crying in a house with no babies.
Oh, in a house with no babies. Got it. Got it. Got it. Okay. Oh, all right. All right. All right. Okay. I'm with
Phantom
you.
babies. Sorry, I should have made that clear.
Phantom. Well, you probably did, but it's me. Okay. So Keel decided to ask them a really weird question. Did you ever dream there was a stranger in the house in the middle of the night? Dun dun dun.
And did he look like me?
Or did
Because
somebody just throw a sheet over him and tell him to dance?
because exactly. Because if you saw somebody look like me, that wasn't me.
It
I
wasn't
swear to God,
me.
it was just a dream. It was just you were just
It's a dream.
so. Daughter Linda didn't just dream about a stranger. She reported that a big guy in a checkered shirt was standing above her one night when she opened her eyes. She hadn't slept alone in her room ever since.
Well, listen. Was he shapely?
No comment on that.
Because I'm saying.
He was wearing a big checked shirt. It was probably a petite extra large and had a Talbot's tag still attached to it.
I'm just thinking it could be a lumberjack from Alaska.
It could be a lumberjack from Alaska, but
Which I'd be okay with that if I saw
who
that.
who wouldn't?
Right? That's all I'm saying. Okay, but wait, there's more. On March 31st, Mrs. Doris
DeWeese.
Deweese was looking out her window and saw a glowing object in the sky. She watched as it moved through the air and crashed into a shack on a nearby hillside. I shouldn't laugh
And
because
she's
that
like,
could.
Abner, Abner.
I know. I shouldn't laugh. That's terrible.
Samantha Stevens just threw something and it crashed into that shack. I swear to God. Okay, so the interesting thing about this is that the shack held the transmitter for the sheriff's radio. After the object crashed, the shack caught fire, and for the next few days, the sheriff's department had some significant trouble with their radios and couldn't get calls about stills and moonshine being brewed in people's backyards for days. So,
Interesting.
what are you going to do?
All right. Well, that same night, March 31st, Officer Harold Harmon and John Keel crossed the river and headed south to the small town of Gallipolis. The Galapagos Ferry? Gallipolis? Gallipolis. I know.
I say Gallipolis.
Gallipolis. Gallipolis Ferry. I teach kids to read good. Okay.
And do other things good too.
Other good things good too. The TNT area had become more of a tourist trap recently where everyone came to see if they could spot a UFO or the Mothman. They'd take either one.
They would. So Officer Harmon and Keel found themselves out on a hillside near Gallipolis. God damn it.
Just say Galapagos.
Galapagos Ferry. Gallipolis Ferry, and we're not disappointed. So they're like, everybody's at the TNT area. Now we're too cool for this. We're gonna go somewhere else and be by ourselves.
And we know we're gonna see something.
So they went out to Gallipolis Ferry and were not disappointed. Lots and lots and lots of UFO sightings occurred that night, but also something a little stranger than your average run-of-the-mill UFO sighting occurred.
Keel reported that as they walked over hillsides, they noticed what appeared to be dark purple blobs hovering over the property belonging to Rolf Lee. Keel pointed the beam of his super strong flashlight at one of the blobs, and it moved out of the way of the light.
Intrigued, he shone the light at another blob, and the same thing happened. Oh, okay. Hold on. Intrigued, he shone the light at another blob, and the same thing happened. It dodged out of the way. Over and over, he repeated this, and over he got the same result.
They do show that, like, when you see those videos and stuff, things dart and move like that. I don't know if they are actually reacting to light, but yeah, that's interesting. Now, before we legit or bullshit this, which I kind of just did, we have one more big encounter to discuss. This occurred in November of 1966, but John Keel and Mary Hyre didn't hear about it until that April of 1967, when all these other UFO sightings were occurring.
This woman wanted to report her encounters, but didn't want to give her real name. So Keel refers to her only as Mrs. Bryant and describes her
Of course he does.
as a reserved, well-spoken, middle-aged woman who looked slightly fatigued from overwork, to which Mrs. Bryant said, "Fuck
Fuck
you,
you.
John Keel."
You look slightly fatigued as a hotshot rider.
That's right. God.
Okay, so she reported that the previous November, so it had been November of 66, she had been out behind her work building around 7 or 8 o'clock at night, getting ready to go home. She saw a flash of light, sort of like a camera flash, and then saw what she described as a kind of flying machine shaped like a big cylinder. It landed in the parking lot around 20 feet away from her. Oh, that's pretty close.
Mm-hmm.
20 feet's pretty close. Every instinct told her to run, but she was paralyzed, completely unable to move.
Thank God she didn't have a baby to drop.
Right?
Two men exited the craft and crossed the parking lot toward her. She said this: "They were normal sized, normal looking men, but their skins were a funny color, dark, like maybe they were heavily tanned, like George Hamilton. The light was pretty bad there, so I couldn't see them all that well. Their faces seemed kind of pointed, pointed noses, pointed chins, high cheekbones, pointed, goddammit. There was a kind of evil look about them. I was afraid I was going to get robbed or attacked."
She reported they talked to her, wanting to know her name, where she was from, what she did for a living. Again, just like all the others who had been encountering beings like this, she commented on their speech, describing it as high and sing-songy.
The strangest thing they asked her was, "What is your time?" After a while, they walked back to the craft and took off. Not long after that, she saw them again, this time in broad daylight. They walked right down Main Street in slow motion, right in Gallipolis, and they were dressed in normal clothes, just like anyone else in town. "You can tell by
Now,
the
by
way
the way,
I
I
use
use
my
my walk. I'm a woman's
woman's
man.
man.
No
No
time to
time to
talk.
talk." There you go.
Yeah, absolutely. And she said this, they looked like anybody. They sort of nodded to me when they passed me. I got scared all over again, real scared. That's when I went to the police and told them what I saw. They laughed at me and said I was probably just imagining things.
'Cause she's a hysterical woman.
Because she's hysterical.
And this wasn't the first weird experience Mrs. Bryant had. She lived outside Gallipolis on a farm, and in 1963 and 1964, she had trouble with someone coming out to the fields and butchering her cattle. She said this:
Whoever they were, they didn't seem to want the choice cuts. They just took the brains, the eyeballs, the udders, and organs that, we'd normally throw away.
I always throw the udders away too.
Right?
And when asked if she'd ever caught anyone in the act of mutilating her cattle, she said this:
Several times. I'd see them out in the field and go after them with a shotgun, but they always got away. They're tall men and they wear white coveralls. Ooh, the tall whites.
Mhm.
Ooh. Which is kind of stupid because they really stand out in the dark and they can certainly run and jump. I've seen them leap over high fences from a standing start.
Sadly, her house burned down during this time as well, and she built a new one on the same site. One night, she double locked the kitchen door, like always, and went to bed, only to awake later in the night, unable to move.
Uh-oh.
She lay there, paralyzed and listening, horrified to hear the kitchen door ease open.
That I would be in an ultrasonic fear bubble thing
Yeah, exactly,
and
right?
as well. Yes. Okay, so as she watched, a tall figure walked into the house, uh-oh, crossed the room, and walked out the other side. Once it left, she was able to move again.
Well, after Keel talked with Mrs. Bryant, he decided he needed to see this place, so he paid a visit to the farm. There, he talked with her oldest boy, who was a teenager at the time. This this kid confirmed his mother's stories about the cattle rustlers and also reported seeing UFOs out there himself from time to time. He also said their phone went dead occasionally, and other times they got random calls where all they heard were a series of beeps and strange noises.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so let's legit or bullshit here. What do we think about the Lilly family? How about the Bryants? And why is no one seeing the Mothman? Um, I I feel like the Bryants thing is absolutely legit.
Yeah, she's seeing some weird shit out there with that family.
I agree with that. The Lilly family. What one was that one again?
The Lilly family's the
Oh, the noises, right?
the Lilly family is the girl who Linda Lilly who sees the man in a checked shirt.
Oh yeah, the man in the checkered shirt. Well, I'd like to believe that one's true. Um, I don't know. What do you think about that one?
I think that the Bryants definitely saw something and that was true.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that it's weird that stuff was out in the middle of their field. I'm curious as to why there's no police report on that. If she's saying the police laughed at her because she talked about the person landing in the parking lot or the UFO landing in the parking lot, certainly she would have had to file reports on cattle mutilation, right? And I wish Keel would have commented on that in his book, and he didn't. So I that bothers me a
Well,
skosh.
why would she have to report it if they laughed at her? Maybe she wouldn't report it. I'm sure
If
for insurance reasons she would have to.
she would have to. I mean, if she's reporting, I mean, if she's making her living from cattle and she's also working in town. My guess is she's got some hard financial issues. So I would think that she would report if something, plus, if someone's coming on your property and killing your
Right.
cows, the cows are not cheap. You know, they used to
No.
hang people for cattle rustling. So
Right.
I don't know why there's no mention of reports on that. So
Right.
I'm on the fence on that one.
Oh, okay. All right. Um, what about the Lilly family? What do you think about that? The checkered shirt.
It's interesting how she described that man because that's a thing. People will wake up and see someone in a black and white checkered shirt on their bed. And uh, that I think is legit. All the
Oh,
stuff
do
that
you?
was happening. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I knew that people could wake up, and have that sleep paralysis and be awake. um, I didn't know that there was a checkered shirt involved. This is the first I've heard of that, but I haven't heard many stories though.
Yeah.
Um, I've heard it could be like something more scary or more demonic looking.
I think so. But I also think that people who wake up and will see that thing or
Yeah.
that creature or individual on the side of the bed, and it's generally associated with UFO sightings and other weird stuff. So
Interesting.
not a lot on
Interesting.
it. Somebody needs to write a book on that.
You should get on that.
I'm not going to do that.
Well, okay, and there it hard pass from Jen. Hard pass on that one. Okay. All right. Now I see. Now I scooted up to see. Okay. Well, do you want to speculate on why no one has seen the Mothman?
I don't know why no one's seen the Mothman. The whole thing is about the Mothman, but there was so much else that happened. It starts kind of like people are seeing the Mothman, weird shit is happening, but then there's all this UFO stuff, all this Men in Black stuff, and Mothman stuff really isn't being reported quite as much.
Well, but then remember the clicks and things on the phones, and they
Mhm.
depicted that in the movie. Now, I don't know how well the movie stuck with. I don't know what liberties Hollywood took with that, okay, with the
The movie
story.
has nothing to do with the book whatsoever. The book
Okay.
is an account of John Keel's research into the Mothman. The movie is has nothing to do with it. It's
Okay.
weird.
So, but they in there they talk or they show, Richard Gere's in his hotel room and he gets the clicks and the things like that too. So, I'm wondering, this is my feeling that the Mothman has made his presence known visually, and now he's gone through the portal or he's in the ether or something and he's making it known audibly. He's still warning, but he doesn't want to
Oh,
get shot and he doesn't want he's tired of maybe freaking people out on a personal level, making them, possibly drive into trees or whatever, when they're out driving. He doesn't want to scare people. Jen, he has a heart and he has a conscience and he doesn't want to scare people anymore. So he's just going to do click, click, clicks over the phone.
maybe it's like Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire when he gets the egg, and
Mm,
anytime he opens it, it's just a shrieking. But
right.
when he takes it underwater, then he hears the mermaid song. I
Yeah.
think if people would have just taken their phone into the bathtub with them, maybe they would have heard stuff.
You know what? They might have, or they'd be dead. Whichever. Something would have happened if they had
Something
taken
like
their phone in the
that. So,
bathtub with them.
just something to think about.
Something to think about. I agree.
Think about.
I agree with that.
All right, moving on.
Okay, moving on. We're moving on. Yeah, we're moving on. Well, things continued along through 1967. UFOs were seen all over the place. Reports were filed regularly, and John Keel began to attract their attention. See, he'd go out into the hills at night and wait for the lights to show up, because there's nothing creepy about that. Sometimes he'd take Mary Hire with him. Sometimes he'd go with someone else. Okay, now I just had a thought because in at school we're reading the Wednesday Wars, and that is a novel that takes place in the 1960s. So we had to give our kids background knowledge about the Wednesday Wars, okay? So 1960s background knowledge, right? So there was a shit ton going on in the 60s politically as well. Tons of new laws were passed. People were fighting for equal rights all over the board, women, minorities, people with special needs, um, uh, gay rights. So, I mean, the 60s are chock full of unrest, right? Riots, murders happened at these riots, all of that. Do you think this happened? Okay, so this happened in America. America was definitely at a civil unrest during this decade.
Mhm.
Could there be some sort of coinky dink there with all of the unrest that is going on and all of the fighting that is going on here? Could that have attracted attention from UFOs and other such creatures?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic.
Also, you talk about the Wednesday Wars. Interestingly, the vast majority of um, UFO sightings occurred on Wednesdays.
Shut up. Shut up.
The Wednesday phenomenon. Um, Also, UFOs are often sighted above places like nuclear power plants um, and military facilities. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Okay. All right.
So,
Very interesting.
so
Okay.
anytime Keel saw a UFO, he'd shine his light at it. It might descend, it might shoot straight up into the sky, it might completely and instantaneously vanish. But perhaps the strangest thing occurring at the time was that John Keel was being followed.
Ooh, or watched. He wasn't sure, but often when he was at a house conducting an interview about UFO sightings, the phone would ring, and when it was answered, beeps and electric buzzes would be on the other end of the line.
He and Mary Hyre began to perform what they called spot checks. They would visit houses with no history of having filed a report of a UFO sighting. This was basically like a paranormal cold call.
Laugh if you will, but they were shocked at the number of people who admitted that yes, there certainly was some weird shit going on, but they just hadn't felt confident enough to report it.
These people reported footsteps on their roofs or metallic clangs like car doors slamming when there were no car doors around. One family reported the opening to their attic had been moved.
What? That's just craziness. But no one could have been more shocked than John Keel was when he knocked on a door and the man who answered threatened him with a shotgun. I know who you are, he said. We don't want anything to do with you. Get out of here.
So John did the smartest thing he could. He took Mary with him the next day and made her go to the door and ask, "What the fuck? Why are you dissing on my homie like that? This is a hot shot writer from New York.
Do you not understand that,
Do
people?
not get it."
Hot shot being the operative word there.
So then she handed this guy a note that John Keel had written, and it said, "Do you like me? Yes or no?
Check the
one."
box.
Yes.
um Okay, well, once it was all sorted out, the man was very apologetic. Of course he was. The UFO people had been up to their usual tricks. The man said this.
You're not going to believe this, but 10 minutes before you arrived here yesterday, I got a phone call. It sounded like a neighbor of mine, and he said he was calling to warn me about a crazy man, a real dangerous guy with a beard that had just been to see him. He said I shouldn't have anything to do with him. 10 minutes later, you showed up. After you left, I called him back. He was out in the fields, had been all day. His wife had to go get him. He said he hadn't made that motherfucking phone call. Well, what the fuck? And that wasn't all. The man had more to say.
About a week ago, something scared my cows real bad. We ain't told anyone about this, Mrs. Haya. That night, our cows really acted up. They stampeded. They were so scared, they went right through the fence over there. It's an electric fence. Now, you know that it takes a lot to make cows charge through an electric fence. Anyway, when I heard the ruckus, I ran outside and I saw my cows scattering down the road. And there was a big red and white glowing thing sitting right in the field. I ran back to my house to get my gun. Didn't take me more than a minute. But when I got outside, again, the thing was gone.
The only thing left was a giant fairy circle behind his barn. He showed the spot to John and Mary, and when they asked if any of his cows had gone missing or been harmed, he said no, but his dog, Hercules, ran off and never returned.
Oh, these dogs. First Bandit, now Hercules.
Mm-hmm.
The farmer also showed them inside of the barn. His circuit box had been fried the night of the stampede, and he'd had to put a new one in. What's more, power poles had been destroyed as well, a phenomenon that occurs in cases of UFO visitation.
I need to say one thing.
Say it.
It would not be astonishing for the cows to have stampeded through an electric fence if the circuit box had been short-circuited and if power poles were down. And I find that throughout this, there are little nuances like that. We're supposed to jump on the bandwagon and be like, oh my God, those cows stampeded through an electric fence. Well, that would not be a big deal for them to do if there was no power going to the electric fence.
Right.
Okay. I just wanted to say that. So let's talk about
I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. So let's talk about one more group of incidents that occurred through 1967, leading up to the grand finale of the UFO, MIB, and Mothman events of Point Pleasant. This involves flash photography.
It started with John Keel and a lady friend who were walking along 42nd Street and 3rd Avenue in New York City when a tall, very thin man came around the corner in front of them, lifted a camera, took their picture, and then turned and ran away. The man was tall and thin with pointed features and dark skin, just like the other dude.
A couple of days later, Dan Drayson reported he was walking through Midtown Manhattan when a man from India, dark skin, black suit, took his picture and ran away.
Back in West Virginia, Mrs. Heyer's weird little man returned. She saw him on the street. When he saw her, he panicked, took off running, and jumped into a black car that drove off down the street.
3 days after that, Mrs. Heyer was returning to her home after a meeting. The time was 11:30 p.m. As she began to unlock her front door, a big black car pulled up and a man climbed out, raised a camera, and snapped her picture.
And a man from Point Pleasant was driving along Route 2 one April evening near the Chief Cornstalk hunting ground when a large black form began to pursue him. It came out of the woods and flew up over his car, where it stayed, easily keeping up with him as he stepped on the gas. Several months later, the man came easily keeping up with him as he stepped on the gas.
That was the Mothman, I think. So later on, that man came home to discover someone in his apartment, an intruder. And he said this: when I opened the door, I saw this man standing in my living room. Man, I think he dressed all in black. I couldn't see his face. Jesus, man. He was about 5'9". I started to fumble for the light switch when he took my picture. There was a big flash of light, so bright I couldn't see a thing. While I was rubbing my eyes, the fucking burglar darted past me and went out of the open door. I guess I arrived just in time because nothing was missing, man. What was it, man?
And that is where we will pick up next week when we bring you the latest episode in our Mothman trilogy. Okay, so let's legit or bullshit this last part. What do we think about flashes, the aliens? What do we think about the flashes the aliens or UFO travelers were emitting from their ray guns?
You know, it reminds me of the movie Men in Black where they flash something and make people forget.
Right.
And one thing, we'll talk a little bit more about this in our next episode, which actually we keep talking about next week, but our episodes are going to be dropping every 2 weeks. So
Right.
it'll be 2 weeks before you hear our next episode. But one of the things that seems to be common with these flashes of light is that sometimes people will experience a flash of light and then they will have lost a couple of hours.
Right.
Something will have happened and then
Yeah.
they find themselves driving somewhere else or being somewhere else, or they're in a parking lot. They've been driving along a road and then suddenly they're in a car and they don't know, and their car is actually moving, and they're in a car and they're in a parking lot or parked on a different street and they don't know what happened. So, you know, it's possible that the flashes of light are to hypnotize, and perhaps the people who remember the flashes of light aren't affected by that. And so they're the ones who report it. So how many flashes of light are going unreported because the people end up hypnotized?
It could be happening right now and
It
we don't
could.
even know it.
I
We
know.
could have just been flashed.
I
And it
know.
could have just been flashed again.
I know.
And again.
I know. It's crazy, right?
Gosh, it's very intense to think about.
I know.
It makes my head hurt.
It's a lot.
It is a lot. Well, very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that the only one, the only thing so far that I think that I can give my full 100% bullshit meter to is when he was in the TNT building.
Yeah.
I honestly don't think that was it. But other than that, yeah, I mean, I think the other stuff's possible.
Yep, I agree. So next week we'll conclude and we'll get to the bridge destruction.
In 2 weeks.
Kind of in 2 weeks. Yes. God damn it. So it'll be interesting. So We want to thank everyone for tuning in and listening. You make every episode awesome.
Be sure to tune in next time to hear the conclusion of this crazy tale and to see what our Yeti scores are.
Until then, remember Ichabod loves you. Rickabod loves you.
Oh, so carry a flashlight and always bring extra pants. You'll need them.
For real.